Hey everyone, and welcome to the climax, the conclusion of Digital Foundry's Crysis Trilogy Remastered coverage. And we're looking at Crysis 3 here on PlayStation and Xbox platforms. And joining me to discuss this very interesting game is John Linneman.
Yes, Rich, it's good to be here with you. Alex and I have been doing most of the Crysis coverage, but I'm very happy we could get you in on Crysis 3 because I know you love this game.
Absolutely, yeah. It's basically been a case of having benchmarked it now for 8 years. You've got to like it to continue benchmarking it, but fundamentally I just really think this is a great game that didn't quite get an audience at the time, and if we can help spread the message beyond what we've been doing for the last 8 years, that would be brilliant.
It's also the first game that I ever sort of tested for DF. This was this was effectively like the job application test, if you will.
Yeah.
So it's a special game for all of us. We love Crysis 3. So
what is so special about it? I mean, it came out early 2013, but it was effectively a next generation game for the time. But it never came out on what were the next generation platforms. We had the PC version, which continues to defy PC hardware up to the present day. And we had the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 versions, which, well, let's be generous, they're suboptimal, to say the least.
yeah.
Playable, but not great. But, you know, it's a fantastic game. What we actually saw was the precursor to a lot of really interesting technologies that cropped up throughout the generation. The lighting quality here, the quality of the materials, post-processing, shading quality, character rendering were all top class back in the day. I still think they hold up today. I think just about the only thing I'm not so happy about is that anti-aliasing moved on quite significantly in this generation, and that wasn't really such a strong point in this particular release.
No, that was always a limitation. And thankfully, if you're playing on PC, that's no longer an issue with Remastered due to DLSS. But yeah, it's that's one of its weak points. But as you say, this feels like a game that should have been cross-gen but never got those releases until now, right? Like,
yeah,
because you could tell those machines were struggled. We even heard about a Wii U version that was in the works, but never came to fruition. So alas, that doesn't exist. But I swear, you put Crysis 3 toe-to-toe against any of those, like the first half of last generation shooters, and it holds up really well against them. It's kind of shocking.
Absolutely. I can see what they were trying to do with this game. They were trying to go back to something akin to the wide linear gameplay of the first series entry. They didn't quite get there. It's still sort of more biased towards linear, but you get these wide open spaces. I think what I really like about this game is that, first of all, they managed to sort out stealth.
Yeah.
Which is a big deal. The AI is improved over Crysis 2. The inclusion of the bow allowing you to basically be aggressive while cloaked is an absolute game changer. The different arrowheads for the bow are just absolutely phenomenal. I really like this game because if you put it on the low difficulty level, you're basically a superhero.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can't do, but you can scale it up. It becomes a lot more challenging. You can embrace the stealth aspects. You can really put the bow through its paces. I mean, I think they have the ability to adjust the tension of the drawstring. That's kind of crazy stuff in there.
And I think what fundamentally, when you get to the bottom of this, what makes it so interesting to me is how, even playing this 8 years later, you have this sense of wanting to improve your playthrough of each room. You go to each area and each one is a scenario.
Yep.
You've played it many times before, but you always feel like you can optimize it. You can do something a little better to get through it. And often you do. And it's like learning that and executing that is really fun, and that's something that is kind of missing in many shooters, I think, since then.
Yeah.
So it's just very satisfying to learn and play. Even if maybe if you've never played it, the first playthrough could actually be a little frustrating. I remember this as well. But once you really learn the game, it really rewards this sort of play.
Yeah, absolutely. And what can I say? The problem, I guess, in 2013 was that the game was too ambitious for the consoles of the period, and the game did actually run better than Crysis 2, significantly so, I'd say.
Yes.
But if we look at what they had to do to get there, PC equivalent settings are lower than low. Performance is still an issue. I mean, we're no longer at 14 frames per second territory as we were with Crysis 2, but it is still mostly low 20s when things are really being pushed. It's not great. And even if you did actually hit the frame rate cap, it was 31 frames per second. So that kind of nerfed the fluidity of the back compat versions on Xbox, which were otherwise pretty decent. I mean, we can do PS360 to Series X and PlayStation 5 comparisons to show how far we've come, but it's a bloodbath, right? You got 2x to 3x the frame rate, a gigantic increase in resolution. They were sub 720p on PS3 and Xbox 360. Material quality, lighting, shading quality just generally takes a massive hit. Draw distances aggressively pulled in. Grass. They tried, I think, is the sort of takeaway there.
Yeah.
But I think what is more interesting is if you take a look at Crysis 3 on PC, and you can see basically how they've managed to achieve this remaster, right? I mean, it's probably more of a port than a remaster.
Yeah, that's a fair thing to say. I mean, they've made some tweaks to some of the materials and certain scenes and improved aspects of the rendering, but most of the big features are exclusive to the PC version of Crysis 3 Remastered.
Yeah.
But honestly, that doesn't sound great on paper, but Crysis 3 looks so good as is that this actually winds up not being a bad thing, because you basically have a highly playable version of the game now running at beautiful frame rates, as we'll get to, and it's finally the way it should have been in the first place.
Yeah, so I did reboot the PC version of the game, but the bottom line is you can see now, side by side, that this really is a PC port. I'm running it on max settings there on a 3080 Ti. It still doesn't quite hit 4K 60 locked on very high settings, so you can see that strategic nips and tucks at the quality to get it running on console. But the big thing is obviously PS5 Series X have the DRS, just like Crysis 2, that scales between 1080p and 2160p. What this does mean is that in the busiest scenes, it's clearly not a 4K game, but it looks good enough on a 4K screen, and that's the price you're paying for a consistent 60 frames per second. And I think it's fair to say that, 3080 Ti, 3090 class PC hardware, it's effectively twice as powerful as Series X, so something had to give. But it still looks pretty awesome.
It's amazing how demanding this game still can be.
Absolutely.
I gotta say, but yeah, it is nice that they use that. That was actually one of the critiques we had for Crysis 1 Remastered at launch, was their DRS was not nearly aggressive enough.
Yep.
And the frame rate was just all over the place.
Yeah.
But this time they've really focused on tuning it so that your frame rate is always fluid.
I think it still looks as though we're using one of the legacy forms of anti-aliasing here, so it's not quite as refined as I was hoping there, but again, I guess there are certain limitations that were placed for this particular port. But I think something which was a bit of a whoa moment for us yesterday was, one of the big issues we've had with the PC version was the 30 FPS grass.
Yes.
Where essentially you could be playing the game at a locked 60, but the grass would be running at half a frame rate, and it's such a important part of the visual makeup in a few of the levels that this is a bit of an issue.
That's right.
But looking at Series X here, the grass now runs at 60 frames per second, which is really nice.
And this is actually a key thing that, so Alex and I, when we were previewing the game way earlier in the year and giving feedback, this is something we hammered pretty hard. Like, guys, you've got to fix the grass issue, because it was always sort of a blemish, especially if you're over 60 FPS on PC. Like, the grass updating at such a low rate, it never looked great. And yeah, they have fixed that now.
Yeah.
And the grass is awesome.
Yeah,
looking.
it looks much better, and I was particularly impressed to see that the 60 FPS grass is also there on Series S, which has had a couple of nips and tucks. So
right.
Yeah, it's pretty decent, I think. Okay, so let's go into the platform comparisons, and I guess we'll start with PS5 and Series X. Now, these are just like Crysis 2, they're not native applications. It is basically the Pro and this 1X versions running via enhanced back compat. But I'm actually really impressed by this, because it looks as though some of the legacy trappings we've seen on prior back compat plus titles have been bypassed. So it looks to me like PS5 and Series X are effectively identical. I think Series X might have a slight DRS advantage, but it's nothing to write home about. Everybody gets a good experience here. And they both look pretty much the same.
Interesting note about DRS is that it does change constantly. Like we've seen the debug information in action, and it's pretty much, it can change from frame to frame, right? So it makes getting an exact lock on this very difficult to know in terms of like which one is higher than the other, right? And that's part of the key of why it's so smooth now, is that it is constantly checking and updating the resolution based on what's going on. And for those that are wondering, it is not distracting. You don't notice the resolution shifting because it's usually in very small increments or not at all, depending on what it finds. So you're not like seeing massive jumps from like 4K to 1080p in one frame, right?
No. But where you are seeing a massive jump is with Xbox Series S, which again, similar to Crysis 2 Remastered, is in a 900p to 1440p DRS window. And I'd say it's very obviously towards the lower end of that scale, similar to Crysis 2, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's usually in the 1080p to 900p range, I found, which, you know, in pursuit of frame rate, it makes sense. But for Series S, you do have to wonder, I don't know, this could have been feasible, but a 30 FPS high resolution option could have been useful for that specific machine.
Possibly. I wouldn't trade it for the frame rate, though.
No,
if I had to choose one or the other, that's what I'd do.
Yeah, it's the right choice.
Yeah, and the only other difference I noticed with Series S is that level of detail. There seems to have been a slight tweak, a slight pullback on that. It's barely noticeable, but there seems to be like a band of detail in the mid-distance that basically is gone. I'm not sure whether that's a bug or whatever. It's quite subtle, but it is there.
No, you're exactly right. They did make some changes to this platform as well. And in fact, all the different consoles, there are very subtle tweaks made to the different machines to ensure performance. And it's usually stuff that's kind of invisible to the eye. Like you might have on like the base Xbox, they do some stuff with like numbers of shadows and the distance and things like that.
Right.
You know, but things that it's hard to compare, but it's something to consider. They were working to ensure a good version on each platform.
Performance, I want to quickly just skirt over this because there's not really much to say. Series X and PlayStation 5, 60 frames per second, and that really wide DRS window essentially guarantees you 60 frames per second, pretty much from start to finish. It's not really an issue. Good test for frame rate is the final jungle area in Welcome to the Jungle, the second stage. Traditionally on PC, this really caused issues for CPU and GPU because there's so much going on, so much grass, long draw distances, lots of physics, lots of explosions. Both of those platforms hold up, and it's pretty much flawless on Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. That's pretty good. I do have an issue, though, with the checkpoint stutter on PlayStation, because it's barely an issue on Xbox. I mean, 1 or 2 frame drops or nothing whatsoever. It's pretty good overall.
Yeah, not a big deal.
Not a big deal. PlayStation, well, the stutter is like, it can be in the region of like 450 milliseconds, almost half a second. So you're seeing a big dip on the frame rate graph there, but it's, you know, essentially the game is freeze framing for half a second. I really hope they can do something about this, because it is the case where you can have checkpoints that are actually quite close together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just obtrusive in a way that it isn't really on Xbox. But yeah, otherwise 60 FPS, glorious. Series S, not bad, actually, generally fine is what I've written on my notes. It's similar to Crysis 2 in that only heavy use of transparency effects seems to cause any issues. You can see it actually right at the very first level, which was probably not the best place to put it, but there it is. Small drops from 60. But beyond that, it's just a bit of slowdown on screen-filling explosions, which is pretty much what you saw in Crysis 2.
Exactly, same thing.
So overall, these consoles play this game really well, and I'm loving it. So out of the 7 versions I tested, these ones were definitely the cream of the crop.
The thing to add on top of that is that if you go back to the old console versions, not only is the frame rate low, but the input latency seems really high.
Yes.
Whereas here, I feel like it's the frame rate and the actual controller response is really, really crisp. And that just moving around the game now feels fantastic.
Absolutely.
As it should.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to the last gen consoles, and we'll start with the enhanced models, PS4 Pro, Xbox One X. Now, obviously, this is essentially the same code that is running on PS5 and Series X. So, well, from what I can see, it's basically the same thing, but running at 30 frames per second instead. The same 1080p to 2160p DRS range. I think in this case, though, it's pretty clear that the One X has a significant resolution advantage over the Pro, which isn't exactly news at this point, is it?
No.
But performance-wise, 30 FPS, properly delivered, even frame pacing, isn't an issue for either console. Both of them just power through.
Which, by the way, that's another victory because Crysis 1 Remastered, as you recall, also had incorrect frame pacing when capped at 30 FPS. I believe that's fixed there, and it is also not a problem here.
Xbox One X here just really comes across as a 30 FPS version of Series X, as you would imagine, really. And it's the same with the Pro, but with that resolution hit. Obviously, it's still got the checkpoint stutter, which is exactly the same as it is on PS5, which is kind of curious, really, because it suggests that the SSD isn't really making much of an impact.
Yeah, it seems to be something else entirely causing that.
I really hope they can look at that. But let's move on. The final brace of conversions to look at, the base PS4 and Xbox One. And, well, we move from DRS to NRS. No resolution scaling.
Oh, yeah.
Standard 900p on Xbox One S, 1080p on PS4. And because the anti-aliasing isn't that great looking, you can actually see there's quite a significant difference in terms of the quality of the presentation, and PS4 is clearly looking a good chunk better here, I'd say.
This is actually interesting because this is different from Crysis 2 Remastered, where the anti-aliasing was sort of revamped somewhat.
Right.
And so the 900p to 1080p difference is less noticeable. But the AA solution used in Crysis 3, yeah, it definitely reveals an issue there.
It looks as though the overall visual makeup of the game is pretty much the same as the other versions. It's still really good looking. But you can see that the LOD drawbacks from Series S are present here, I think on both versions. And also, again, as you noted in Crysis 2, there seems to be like a sort of fallback position on tessellation. It's not quite as rich.
In Crysis 2, it's just disabled on those consoles completely, so it's not there.
Makes sense. It's likely what we're seeing here too then, I guess.
Well, I just want to say, I kind of mentioned this in Crysis 2, but it's something I really like to reflect on here, because this was a game released originally right before the new consoles launched, basically, right? Because fundamentally, you know, I kind of feel like this is what the game would have looked like if it had been released on Xbox One back around launch, because we had Rise running at 900p as well, and it actually uses a lot of similar techniques, although they pushed forward with their materials and such. But, you know, it actually turned out good, and it's kind of fun to reflect back on what could have been, because we always felt back then that, yeah, this should have been on Xbox One and PS4, really. Back during that early release window. It just wasn't. And now it's finally there, and then, you know, we get to see what it probably would have looked like.
Yeah, I do take issue with you on one point, though, because Rise, again, had something weird going on with its 30 FPS cap.
You're right. And because Crysis 1 Remastered did as well, you know, it does make you wonder, like, would it actually have had the same incorrect frame pacing issue that we had seen in many games, or just the 31 FPS cap, perhaps?
Yeah, and also I guess we've got the benefit here of developers that have got the fully mature XDK on the Microsoft side, and so I guess that would have helped as well.
Okay, so yeah, that kind of walks the point back a little bit, that perhaps if it had been released in 2013, 2014, it may have actually been worse.
Maybe, yeah. But, you know, we've got it here. It's looking good. Interesting on performance. 30 FPS is 30 FPS. However, I did notice right at the very beginning, that really taxing scene right at the beginning of the game. There's actually a bit of an issue on Xbox One. Nothing tremendously bad as such, but it loses its frame pacing lock there. You actually get a small bout of inconsistently delivered frames, but this really is the exception. I couldn't find it anywhere else throughout my testing. Xbox One is actually looking pretty good here, and the same with PlayStation 4, except it's just fully locked, no issues whatsoever, except, I'm going to say it again, the checkpoint stutter, still annoying. And another issue I'd like to point out is that generally I found the PlayStation versions to be less stable than the Xbox equivalents. Had a number of crashes back to the front end on both PlayStation 5, as you see here, but also on the PS4 consoles too. And bearing in mind I didn't spend a huge amount of time on the Pro and the base PS4, yeah, that's a bit concerning and needs to be looked at. So overall though, let's wrap this up. It's Crysis 3 and it's awesome, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Finally. I think the only real criticism you can level at it is that it is a port more than a remaster. I think that's pretty clear. But I think Crytek can look back on a job well done back in the day in 2013 that basically means that not a huge amount of remastering work was necessary. I mean, I would have liked to have seen some higher resolution textures because some of those have aged a bit, but ultimately so much was done right back in 2013. The game never really got its dues, in my opinion. I just think people need to play this game and enjoy the campaign and spend some time with it because it's just tremendous.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you on that. It's just an awesome shooter all around. Really interesting game to play today. Looks great, plays great, sounds wonderful. And honestly, I mean, we talk a lot about Crysis on here, both because of the technology behind it, but also just the core game design concepts are just excellent. It's
absolutely
a fantastic series.
And I really do highly recommend checking this out. And I guess that's all we've really got to say about this. I mean, I looked at 10 different versions of Crysis 3.
Yeah.
I guess we should point out that the Switch version is also available, which we weren't able to sample ahead of release. We did have those previews, though.
Yeah, and those were based on the Gold Master, but I believe that there is a patch that is either out now or just about to hit. But yeah, we'll check those out on our own, maybe talk about it on the Direct or something.
Okay, so look, let's wrap this up. Please do like, subscribe, share. If you enjoyed the content, ring the bell for those notionally instant notifications. And DF Supporter Program. See this video in pristine 4K via download. Support the team. Gain access to our awesome Discord. Early access. Tons of stuff. It's amazing. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.